Havenwood Hollow, a place where the corn stands impossibly tall and the pumpkins swell like suns, nestled deep in rolling hills that seem to swallow roads and strangers alike. For Ethan Miller, it was the suffocatingly perfect home he fled a decade ago. Now, pulled back by family obligation, he returns on the cusp of the famed Harvest Festival. He finds the unnerving prosperity unchanged, the community smiles tight, their traditions intense. But beneath the bounty lies a chilling secret, a horrifying price paid in blood for the valley's unnatural abundance, and Ethan is dangerously close to discovering the truth behind the Harvest King. The old highway sign for Havenwood Hollow hadn't changed. Faded green paint, peeling white letters, half swallowed by an aggressively verdant tangle of wild ivy. It still promised a slice of paradise, a slogan that had always felt less like an invitation and more like a thinly veiled threat. Ethan Miller slowed his beat-up sedan, the engine groaning in protest as the road began its winding descent into the valley. 10 years. A full decade since he'd driven this road in the opposite direction, fleeing not just the place but the suffocating weight of its flawless facade. Havenwood Hollow nestled in the valley basin like a meticulously arranged model town. Neat farmhouses with pristine white fences, fields bursting with crops that seemed almost unnaturally vibrant even from this distance, and a steeple piercing the impossibly blue sky. It was beautiful, undeniably so. Orderly. Prosperous. And utterly, bone-chillingly isolated. The kind of beauty that felt curated, managed, like a stage set waiting for a play to begin, or perhaps, one that had just ended, leaving behind an unsettling silence. He hadn't wanted to come back. The thought had sat like a stone in his gut ever since his sister, Clara, had called. Their mother, ailing for years, had taken a turn. Not critical, Clara had assured him, her voice strained with the practiced cheerfulness Ethan recognized as a Havenwood staple, but she was weak, and it would mean the world to her if Ethan came for the Harvest Festival. The festival. Of course. It always came back to the festival. Growing up, the Harvest Festival wasn't just an event, it was the town's heartbeat, the focal point around which the entire year revolved. A frantic, almost desperate celebration of abundance that had always made Ethan's skin crawl. The forced joviality, the intense pressure to participate, the way outsiders were subtly scrutinized beneath welcoming smiles, it had all contributed to his departure at 18, armed with a flimsy excuse about college and a desperate need for anonymity. He parked in front of the familiar two-story farmhouse, his childhood home. It looked perfect. A fresh coat of white paint, blooming marigolds lining the walkway, pumpkins clustered artfully on the porch steps. Too perfect. His mother was waiting by the window, her small frame silhouetted against the lace curtains. Clara rushed out, wiping her hands on an apron, her smile wide but reaching her eyes with a slight delay. "Ethan. You made it. Oh, Mom will be so thrilled." Clara's hug felt both genuine and rehearsed. "You look thin. City life not agreeing with you?" "It's fine, Clara. Just busy," Ethan mumbled, pulling his duffel bag from the trunk. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, baked apples, and something else. Dust? No, more like stagnant air, the scent of secrets kept too long in closed rooms. His mother sat in her armchair, a faded floral quilt over her lap. Her eyes, once sharp and assessing, were clouded, but they fixed on him with a flicker of recognition. "Ethan. My boy. You came back. For the festival?" Her voice was a dry whisper. "I came back to see you, Mom," he said, forcing a smile, kneeling beside her chair. "Good. Good. It's important." "This year," she murmured, her gaze drifting towards the window, towards the impossibly golden fields beyond. "Everything must be right." Later that evening, neighbors dropped by. The Carsons, the Brewsters. Faces he remembered, etched with a decade more time but wearing the same placid, watchful expressions. They welcomed him with practiced warmth, inquiries about his life out there laced with subtle judgments about his prolonged absence. "Good to have you back in the fold, Ethan," Mr. Carson said, clapping him on the shoulder a little too hard. "Especially for the festival. A strong community needs all its members." "Wouldn't miss it," Ethan lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The air thickened with unspoken things, with the weight of belonging to a place he desperately wished he could forget. Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows that seemed to writhe in the edges of his vision. Havenwood Hollow was pulling him back into its perfect, terrifying embrace. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of relentless, unnervingly cheerful preparation. Havenwood Hollow didn't just prepare for its harvest festival, it threw itself into the task with a fervor that bordered on obsessive. Ethan, trying to be helpful while simultaneously keeping a low profile, found himself swept up in the communal energy, an energy that felt increasingly brittle the closer he looked. Everywhere he went, abundance spilled over. Corn stalks, tied with intricate ribbons of gold and crimson, adorned every lamppost. Mountains of pumpkins, impossibly large, uniformly orange, sat in sculpted piles on street corners. Tables groaned under the weight of pies, preserves, and freshly baked bread offered freely at impromptu stands. The air was thick with the scent of roasting corn, spiced cider, and damp earth, yet beneath it all, Ethan detected a faint, metallic tang he couldn't quite place. The town square had been transformed. A large wooden stage dominated one end, draped in harvest garlands. Booths selling crafts, baked goods, and local produce crowded the perimeter, each one a picture of rustic perfection. But it was the scale of it all that knotted Ethan. The sheer volume of produce was staggering, far exceeding what seemed possible for a community this size, no matter how fertile the valley. The apples shone with an unnatural gloss, the squashes were almost cartoonishly oversized, and the wheat sheaves stood taller and thicker than any he'd ever seen. It wasn't just plentiful, it was excessive, almost grotesque in its perfection. The townspeople moved with a synchronized, purposeful energy. Smiles were constant, plastered on faces flushed with exertion. Laughter echoed, perhaps a little too loudly, a little too frequently. Their unity was palpable, a seamless choreography of shared purpose. But when Ethan tried to engage in casual conversation, answers felt rehearsed, eyes slid away, and the topic inevitably circled back to the festival, the importance of tradition, the blessings of the harvest. It felt less like community spirit and more like a carefully maintained performance. He was helping unload crates of cider near the town hall when Sheriff Brody approached, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man utterly comfortable in his domain. Dale Brody hadn't aged much in 10 years, maybe a few more lines around his eyes, a touch more gray at the temples, but the same easy smile, the same calm, assessing gaze. "Ethan Miller. Welcome home, son," Brody said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, calloused. "Good to see you back, especially for the big event." "Sheriff," Ethan nodded, shaking his hand. "Town's looking busy. Best time of year," Brody beamed, gesturing around the square. "The Harvest Festival is what holds us together. Reminds us what we work for, what we're grateful for." He paused, his eyes lingering on Ethan for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Glad you decided to join us this year. Participation. It's important. Shows commitment." There it was again. Commitment. Participation. The underlying message was clear: conform, blend in, don't rock the boat. "Just here visiting Mom," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Of course. Heard she wasn't feeling her best." "Give her my regards," Brody said smoothly. "But hey, while you're here, soak it all in. Feel that Havenwood spirit." He clapped Ethan on the back again, a gesture that felt less friendly and more like a subtle assertion of control. "We all have our part to play, Ethan. Every single one of us." As Brody walked away, greeting others with the same practiced warmth, Ethan felt a chill despite the autumn sun. The sheriff's words, seemingly innocuous, echoed the sentiment he felt radiating from the entire town, a desperate, almost manic insistence on unity and celebration. He looked at the overflowing displays, the vibrant decorations, the smiling faces, and the perfection suddenly seemed fragile, like a beautiful mask hiding something rotten underneath. The metallic tang in the air seemed stronger now, a coppery undertone beneath the sweetness of cider and baked goods. Something was fundamentally wrong with Havenwood Hollow's perfect harvest. The relentless cheerfulness began to grate on Ethan's nerves, pushing his underlying unease closer to the surface. He started paying closer attention, listening past the boisterous greetings and celebratory pronouncements. That's when he began hearing them, the whispers, the hushed conversations that ceased abruptly when he drew near, the coded phrases exchanged with nervous glances. Standing near the bakery, pretending to admire a display of impossibly large loaves, he heard two older women talking behind him. "Needs to be right this year, Martha. Even more than usual. The signs." The second voice was lower, urgent. "Don't talk about it here. Just pray it's enough. Pray the yield pleases." They fell silent as Ethan shifted slightly. When he glanced back, they were smiling tightly at him, discussing the quality of the flour. Later, near the edge of town where the woods began to creep closer to the fields, he saw two farmers leaning against a fence post, their faces grim despite the festival preparations buzzing behind them. "Can't afford another lean time like before," one muttered, kicking at the dirt. The Hollow remembers. "Abernathy says the offering must be significant." The other nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the darkening tree line. "Offering? Yield? Pleases who?" The word snagged in Ethan's mind, fueling the disquiet that had haunted him since his return. He thought back to his childhood, trying to recall if there had been similar murmurs back then, things he'd dismissed as adult concerns. He remembered snippets, yes, vague anxieties about bad weather or pests, but nothing like this current, veiled intensity. His thoughts turned to old man Silas. Silas Blackwood lived on the fringes of Havenwood Hollow, both literally and figuratively. His small, unkempt cabin sat nestled in a shadowed patch of woods just beyond the last manicured field, a place kids were warned away from. Ethan remembered him as a quiet, solitary figure, occasionally seen shuffling into town for supplies, his eyes holding a haunted look. People whispered about him, that he was touched, that he'd questioned things best left unquestioned years ago, that he'd refused to fully participate in town life after some unspecified tragedy involving his wife. He was tolerated, but ostracized. Driven by a growing sense of dread, Ethan made his way towards Silas's cabin as dusk began to settle. The path was overgrown, barely discernible. The cabin itself looked neglected, leaning slightly, smoke curling weakly from a stone chimney. He knocked tentatively on the rough wooden door. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches. A pair of weary, deep-set eyes peered out from a weathered face crisscrossed with wrinkles. Silas looked ancient, far older than Ethan remembered. "What do you want?" Silas's voice was raspy, unused. "Mr. Blackwood. I'm Ethan Miller. Martha Miller's son. I used to live here." Recognition flickered in Silas's eyes, followed immediately by suspicion. "Miller boy. Thought you'd left for good. Smartest thing anyone ever did." He made no move to open the door wider. I came back to visit my mother. For the festival," Ethan said, feeling foolish. I was wondering if I could talk to you for a minute." Silas squinted. "Talk? About what? The prize-winning pumpkins? The joyous community spirit?" Sarcasm dripped from the words. "About the festival," Ethan pressed, lowering his voice. "I've been hearing things. Whispers. People seem anxious. Talking about the yield, about offerings." Fear flashed across Silas's face, stark and raw. He glanced nervously over Ethan's shoulder, towards the distant lights of the town. "You shouldn't listen to whispers, boy. Best keep your head down, enjoy the pies, and leave when it's over." "But what does it mean?" Ethan insisted. "What offering? What happens if the yield isn't enough?" Silas's hand trembled as he gripped the doorframe. "It means Havenwood likes its prosperity. It depends on it." He licked his dry lips. "This place. It makes demands. The land remembers old ways." "What old ways? What demands?" "Go home, boy," Silas hissed, his voice suddenly urgent. "Don't dig. Don't ask questions. They don't like questions here, especially not now." He leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of wood smoke and something bitter, like herbs. "This festival. It ain't just about celebrating the harvest. It's about ensuring it. The final night. The culmination. It's not what they say it is." "What is it?" Ethan whispered. Silas shook his head violently, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed deeply ingrained. "Leave, Ethan Miller. Leave before the last bonfire is lit. Before they choose the king. Get out of Havenwood Hollow and don't ever look back. Some prices. They're too high." Before Ethan could ask more, Silas slammed the door shut. The heavy thud of a bolt sliding into place echoed in the twilight. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the old man's cryptic warnings swirling in his mind, mixing with the whispers he'd overheard. Ensuring the harvest. The final night. Before they choose the king. The price. A cold knot formed in his stomach. Old man Silas wasn't just eccentric, he was terrified. And whatever he was terrified of was intrinsically linked to the heart of the harvest festival. The unnerving encounter with Silas solidified Ethan's resolve. He couldn't simply ignore the mounting sense of dread. He started asking questions, subtly at first, trying to gauge the town's undercurrents without drawing too much attention. He focused on casual inquiries about recent happenings, newcomers, anything out of the ordinary besides the all-consuming festival preparations. It was during a strained breakfast with his sister Clara that he first heard about him. Clara was fussing over their mother, trying to coax her to eat more toast, when she mentioned needing extra hands on the farm stand later. "It's just been so hectic," Clara sighed, pushing her hair back. Especially since that young man left. Young man? Ethan asked, trying to sound casual. Oh, some fellow who drifted in a few weeks back, Clara said dismissively. Backpacker type, I think. Said he was looking for temporary work, maybe studying local folklore or some such nonsense. Sheriff Brody put him up in the old boarding house room above the general store. Helped hold Mr. Henderson with some repairs. He left? Must have, Clara shrugged. Packed up and vanished overnight, apparently. Happened? Oh, maybe a week or so ago? Right before the main festival setup started. Odd fellow. Kept to himself mostly, always sketching in that notebook of his. Vanished overnight. Right before the festival. The timing prickled at Ethan's suspicion. It seemed too convenient. He decided to test the waters. Later that day, while picking up some supplies at the general store, a charmingly cluttered place run by the perpetually flustered Mrs. Gable, he brought it up. Heard you had a visitor staying upstairs recently? Ethan asked, examining a jar of local honey. Mrs. Gable froze mid-motion, her hand hovering over the cash register. Her smile faltered for a split second before snapping back into place, tighter than before. Oh. Yes, the young man. Mr. Reed, I think it was? Quiet type. My sister mentioned he left rather suddenly, Ethan probed gently. Moved on, Mrs. Gable said quickly, her eyes darting towards the door. Happens all the time with folks like that. Restless feet, you know. Sheriff Brody handled his things. She busied herself rearranging a display of candles, her movements jerky. Will that be all, Ethan? Lots to do today, the festival waits for no one. The conversation was shut down, politely but firmly. It was the same reaction he got when he casually mentioned the missing backpacker to Mr. Carson later that afternoon. Carson's jovial expression hardened momentarily. Folks come, folks go, Ethan. Havenwood's not for everyone. Best focus on the celebration, eh? Enjoy being back with your own kind. His own kind. The phrase hung in the air, highlighting his complex status, born here, but now an outsider by virtue of his decade-long absence and his inability to seamlessly rejoin the fold. He felt it more keenly now, the subtle shift in how people watched him. Before, it was curiosity mixed with mild judgment. Now, after his visit to Silas and his tentative questions, it felt different. Sharper. More assessing. He caught people looking away quickly when he met their gaze, noticed conversations that lulled when he approached certain groups. The collective warmth of Havenwood Hollow seemed to be developing cold spots, specifically around him. He decided to approach Sheriff Brody directly, catching him overseeing the placement of hay bales near the stage. Sheriff, Ethan began, adopting a concerned tone. I heard about that fellow who was staying here, the backpacker? Seems strange he'd leave without a word. Brody turned, his expression open and friendly, but his eyes were like ships of flint. Ah, young Mr. Reed. Yeah, seemed he got wanderlust again. Left a note saying he was heading west. Paid his dues at the boarding room. No fuss. Did anyone see him leave? Came and went quietly, like he did everything. Brody shrugged. Look, Ethan, I know the city makes folks suspicious, but out here, things are simpler. Man decided to move on. Happens. He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong. Don't you worry your head about drifters. Focus on the festival. Enjoy the homecoming. We're all glad to have you back. The dismissal was smooth, practiced, and utterly final. Brody's calm demeanor didn't reassure Ethan, it unnerved him. It felt like a deliberate closing of ranks, a story agreed upon and presented with unwavering consistency. The backpacker, the outsider, had disappeared just as the town's anxiety about the harvest reached a fever pitch, just as Silas had warned him about the time before the king was chosen. Walking back towards his mother's house, the late afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by any one person, but by the town itself. The neat houses with their dark windows seemed like eyes, the rustling leaves in the unnaturally lush trees whispered his name. His status as an outsider, once a source of mild discomfort, was rapidly becoming a chilling liability. He was asking questions no one wanted asked, noticing things everyone else ignored. And in Havenwood Hollow, that kind of attention felt increasingly dangerous. The missing outsider wasn't just a curious footnote, Ethan suspected he was a harbinger. The community's unified denial about the missing backpacker, coupled with Silas's warnings, propelled Ethan towards a new avenue of investigation, the town's past. If this dark tradition, this price of the harvest, was as old as Silas hinted, There had to be traces of it somewhere, buried beneath the sanitized official history Havenwood Hollow presented to the world. His mother's house, thankfully, held generations of accumulated belongings. The attic, dusty and smelling of dried lavender and decay, was a labyrinth of forgotten furniture, trunks, and boxes. His mother, lost in her own fading memories, wouldn't notice his rummaging. Clara was too consumed by festival duties. He had time. He started with old photo albums. Pictures of past harvest festivals filled the pages, smiling faces, bountiful displays, bonfires lighting up the night. Everything looked wholesome, idyllic. But as he looked closer, comparing photos across decades, a subtle unease crept in. There were faces that appeared in one year's festival photos, seemingly part of the community, only to be absent the next, with no explanation. It was tenuous, easily dismissed as people moving away, but it formed a faint, unsettling pattern. He moved on to boxes of old papers, letters, receipts, farm ledgers. Most were mundane, detailing crop rotations, feed purchases, social visits. Then, tucked away in a brittle leather-bound ledger belonging to his great-grandfather, dated from the early 1930s, a time Ethan knew from local lore had followed a period of devastating blight, he found something. The entries detailed crop yields. After several pages of dismal figures, the numbers suddenly, dramatically, increased. The handwriting became bolder, more confident. Scrawled in the margin next to an entry recording an unprecedented corn harvest was a single, cryptic phrase: "The tithe was paid. The Hollow provides." Further on, another entry noted the exceptional quality of the subsequent year's apples, with another marginal note: "Silas Blackwood's father questioned the blessing." Foolishness. Silas's father? Had the family's ostracization begun that far back? Below that, almost illegible, another line: "Young Ainsley, the hired hand, departed suddenly. Shame. Good worker. Departed suddenly. Just like the backpacker. Just like the faces missing from the photo albums." His heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't concrete proof, but it was a chilling echo across nearly a century. The tithe. The blessing. Sudden departures coinciding with renewed prosperity. He needed more. He remembered a small, seldom-used archive room attached to the town hall, supposedly holding old municipal records. Getting access might be tricky, but he could try claiming he was researching family history. Feigning an interest in genealogy, Ethan managed to talk a flustered town clerk into letting him into the dusty, book-lined room. The air was thick with the smell of decaying paper. He searched through brittle-bound volumes of town council minutes, old newspapers, and registrar records. The official histories were just as he expected: polished accounts of hard-working settlers, community spirit, and agricultural success. Mentions of the harvest festival focused on its joyous celebration of community and bounty. There were records of births, deaths, marriages, but finding records of people leaving was harder. However, digging through archived editions of the Havenwood Herald, a local paper that had ceased publication decades ago, he found small, easily overlooked notices. Missing persons reports, filed occasionally, often around late autumn. Most were followed up weeks or months later with brief updates stating the person had been located elsewhere or the search was discontinued. But the frequency seemed slightly higher than one might expect for such a small, stable community. And sometimes, the missing were described as newcomers, seasonal workers, or individuals known for being unsettled. One particular article from the late 1950s caught his eye. It reported on an exceptionally bountiful harvest following a dry summer that should have decimated the crops. The tone was celebratory, almost miraculous. Tucked away on a back page was a small, separate notice about a traveling artist who had been staying in town and had moved on without notice right before the festival commenced. He found another fragment in a box of uncatalogued correspondence, a letter from a former resident, dated decades ago, written to a relative outside Havenwood. "I can't stand it here anymore," it read. "The way they all pretend. Especially during the festival. Something feels wrong. Old man Hemlock vanished last week, right after he argued with the mayor at the town meeting about crop rotation. They say he went to visit family back east, but his dog is still here, howling by his door. I'm leaving before they find another reason to celebrate the harvest." The fragments weren't a complete picture, but they formed a terrifying mosaic. Cyclical disappearances, often involving outsiders or dissenters. These disappearances frequently coincided with the harvest festival and periods of unexplainable agricultural success. The tithe. The blessing. The offering. It all pointed towards a deliberate, recurring event, carefully obscured and woven into the fabric of Havenwood Hollow's history. hidden beneath layers of enforced normalcy and celebratory tradition. The prosperity wasn't a blessing, it was bought. And the price, Ethan suspected with growing certainty, was human life. Armed with fragmented history and growing dread, Ethan started paying closer attention to the specific traditions of the Harvest Festival itself, trying to see them through the lens of Silas's warnings and his own discoveries. The centerpiece, the most lauded and anticipated event besides the final bonfire, was the crowning of the Harvest King or Queen. Officially, it was the highest honor the community could bestow. The chosen individual was celebrated throughout the final 2 days of the festival, leading the processions, receiving toasts at the communal feasts, and symbolically representing the town's gratitude for the bounty. They were draped in garlands, given a ceremonial, and slightly rustic, crown woven from wheat and autumn flowers, and treated with exaggerated reverence. Ethan remembered it from his childhood as a somewhat baffling, slightly embarrassing affair for whoever was chosen. Usually, it was someone well-liked, perhaps someone who had done a significant service for the community that year. But thinking back, and observing the conversations now, the selection process seemed disturbingly opaque. "Who do you think it'll be this year?" He overheard Mrs. Gable asking Mr. Carson, their voices conspiratorially low despite the surrounding noise of the festival setup. "Hard to say, isn't it?" Carson replied, polishing an already gleaming apple. "Needs to be appropriate. Someone who embodies the spirit." He glanced around, his eyes flicking past Ethan. "Someone deserving of the honor." Deserving? Appropriate? The criteria felt vague, subjective, and malleable. He asked his sister Clara about it one evening, trying to sound casually interested. "So, the Harvest King. How do they actually choose?" Clara, setting out plates for dinner, paused. "Oh, well, the festival committee discusses it. Mayor Abernathy has the final say, of course. They look for someone who truly appreciates Havenwood, someone who embodies our values." She avoided his eyes. "It's a great honor. Has it ever been?" "Someone new to town?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice level. Clara hesitated. "Well, sometimes. If someone has shown great enthusiasm, really embraced our ways. It's a way of welcoming them, you see? Fully into the community." Her explanation sounded flimsy, rehearsed. Ethan pressed further. "What about people who maybe don't quite fit in?" Her hand stilled. "Ethan, why are you asking these questions? It's a celebration. A tradition. Don't make things complicated." Her tone held a warning edge beneath the familial exasperation. He recalled fragments from the past, a year when a cousin visiting from out of state, a slightly rebellious teenager who'd chafed against Havenwood's quiet rules, had been crowned Harvest Queen. He remembered her discomfort, her awkwardness in the spotlight, and how relieved she'd seemed when the festival was over and she could leave. At the time, he'd thought it was just teenage angst. Now, it seemed sinister. Had she been chosen because she was an outsider, someone easily honored and then forgotten once she left? Then there was the year a researcher, studying agricultural practices, had spent the summer in Havenwood. Ethan vaguely remembered him being crowned Harvest King. The man had been flattered but slightly bemused by the intensity of the local customs. He'd left shortly after the festival, publishing a paper that praised Havenwood's unique and highly successful farming techniques, attributing them to meticulous soil management and community cooperation. Had he unknowingly been the honored guest whose presence coincided with a necessary offering? The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The missing backpacker, Mr. Reed. Quiet, kept to himself, an outsider. He fit the profile perfectly. Had he been marked as this year's potential Harvest King before he vanished? Or had his vanishing created the vacancy? A cold sweat broke out on Ethan's skin. The Harvest King wasn't just an honorary title. It was a designation. The honor was a terrifying prelude. The celebration was a way to isolate and elevate the chosen individual before. Before what? Silas's words echoed in his mind, "Leave before the last bonfire is lit. Before they choose the king." He looked around at the festive preparations, the smiling faces, the symbols of abundance. It all felt like a macabre stage setting. The community wasn't just celebrating the harvest, they were preparing for the selection. And the criteria weren't about honoring community spirit, they were about finding a suitable candidate. Someone disposable. Someone whose absence wouldn't disrupt the town's tightly woven fabric. An outsider. A dissenter. Someone like the backpacker. Or someone, Ethan realized with a jolt of pure terror, like himself. A native son who had rejected Havenwood, who had returned reluctantly, who was now asking too many questions. His blood ran cold. The prickle of dread he'd felt earlier intensified into a sickening certainty. The focus on newcomers, on those who didn't quite belong. It wasn't just suspicion. It was assessment. The realization that he himself might fit the profile of a potential Harvest King spurred Ethan into action. The subtle unease had curdled into genuine fear. He had to know the full truth, and there was only one person in Havenwood Hollow who might tell him, Old Man Silas. He waited until nightfall, slipping away from the house while Clara was busy helping neighbors string lights and his mother dozed fitfully. The moon was nearly full, casting long, eerie shadows as he made his way back to the edge of the woods, his footsteps muffled by the damp earth. The lights in Silas's cabin were off, but Ethan sensed the old man was awake. He knocked, more insistently this time. "Mr. Blackwood." "Silas? It's Ethan Miller. I need to talk to you. Please." Silence. Then, the rasping voice from behind the door. "Told you to leave, boy. Told you not to dig." "I know what you warned me about," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. "The Harvest King. The disappearances. I found things. In the old records. The tide. People leaving. Suddenly. The backpacker who vanished." He heard a sharp intake of breath from inside. "Please, Silas," Ethan pleaded. "You said the final night isn't what it seems. You talked about a price. What is the price? What happens to the Harvest King?" A long, tense silence stretched, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant, muffled sounds of festival preparations drifting from the town. Finally, the bolt scraped back, and the door creaked open. Silas stood there, silhouetted against the dim moonlight filtering through a grimy window, his face a mask of anguish and fear. He looked utterly defeated. "You fool," Silas whispered, pulling Ethan quickly inside and shutting the door, fumbling with the bolt again. "A meddling fool. Just like your great-uncle Thomas, questioning things better left buried." The cabin was small, cluttered, smelling of wood smoke, dried herbs, and old fear. A single candle spotted on a rough-hewn table. "My great-uncle?" Ethan asked, confused. "Disappeared," Silas said flatly. "Long time ago. After a harvest festival during a bad year. Said he was going to expose the town. Never made it past the county line." He sank onto a rickety stool, burying his face in his trembling hands. "They don't let the truth leave the valley." "What truth, Silas?" Ethan knelt beside him. "Tell me. What happens?" Silas looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, haunted by decades of silence. "Prosperity," he choked out. "That's what everyone wants. What Havenwood needs. This valley. It was lean land, once. Prone to blight, drought. The first settlers. They struggled. Starved. Then. They made a pact." "A pact? With what?" "With the land. Or whatever dwells in it. An old entity. Something ancient, that feeds on life. On sacrifice." Silas shuddered. "They offered one of their own, in desperation, during the harvest time. And the land responded. The crops flourished. The blight receded. Havenwood Hollow was born from that first offering." Ethan felt sick. "And the harvest festival became the cover," Silas confirmed, his voice barely audible. "A celebration to mask the ritual. Generation after generation. They convinced themselves it was necessary. Tradition. The price for their perfect lives, their overflowing barns. So the Harvest King. Or Queen." Ethan couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. Silas nodded grimly. "Is the sacrifice chosen, celebrated, led like a lamb to the slaughter on the final night, during the peak of the revelry, when everyone is distracted by the bonfire and the dancing?" He gestured vaguely towards the woods. "There's a place. An old stone circle, hidden deep. That's where it happens. An offering to the soil, to the entity, to ensure the bounty continues." "My God," Ethan breathed, the full horror washing over him. "Human sacrifice. Hidden in plain sight, perpetuated by an entire community bound by fear and greed. Who do they choose? Outsiders, mostly," Silas said bitterly. "Easier to explain their disappearance. Drifters, newcomers who haven't put down roots. Or dissenters. Troublemakers. Anyone who threatens the status quo, who asks too many questions." He looked pointedly at Ethan. "Like your great-uncle. Like, potentially, you. Why didn't you leave? Why stay here, knowing this?" A deep sigh rattled Silas's frail body. "My wife. Elara. She was chosen. Years ago. She wasn't from here originally. She always felt uneasy about the festival's intensity. Asked too many questions." His voice broke. They crowned her Harvest Queen. Said it was an honor, a way to make her truly one of them. I was younger then, caught up in the town's beliefs, blinded by the prosperity. I didn't understand until it was too late. I tried to argue, but..." He trailed off, shame etched onto his face. "They ostracized me afterwards. Said my grief had addled my mind. Living on the edge here. It's my penance. And my fear keeps me silent." Ethan felt a surge of pity mixed with the horror. Silas wasn't just an outcast, he was a prisoner of his own guilt and the town's suffocating secret. "The backpacker. Reed," Ethan said. "Was he meant to be this year's king?" Silas nodded slowly. "I think so. I saw Abernathy and Brody watching him. Talking to him. But he must have suspected something. Got spooked. Disappeared before they could secure him. Which means..." "Which means," Silas interrupted, his eyes wide with fresh terror, fixing on Ethan, "they need someone else. Someone appropriate. Someone whose absence wouldn't be too disruptive internally, but who isn't fully part of the core anymore. Someone asking dangerous questions." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. Ethan was the logical replacement. The reluctant prodigal son, poking his nose where it didn't belong. "You have to get out, Ethan," Silas pleaded, gripping his arm. "Tonight. Now. Before they realize you know. Before they decide." But even as Silas spoke, Ethan knew it might already be too late. He thought of the watchful eyes, the strained smiles, Sheriff Brody's veiled warnings. They weren't just suspicious anymore. They were likely observing his every move. Leaving might not be as simple as just driving away. Armed with the horrifying truth, Ethan re-entered the seemingly idyllic world of Havenwood Hollow feeling like a man walking through a minefield. Every smiling face now seemed like a mask, every cheerful greeting a potential threat. Silas's revelation hadn't brought relief, only a sickening clarity and the crushing weight of complicity that permeated the very air he breathed. He tried to act normal, rejoining the festival preparations near the town square, forcing a smile, attempting small talk. But the knowledge festered within him, poisoning every interaction. He found himself scanning faces, looking for cracks in the facade, for any flicker of guilt or doubt. He saw none. Only the same placid, determined expressions, the same unwavering focus on the task at hand. The shift in the community's attitude towards him, however, was no longer subtle. It was palpable. Where before there had been guarded curiosity or mild judgment, now there was a distinct chill. Conversations didn't just lull when he approached, they stopped dead, resuming only after he had moved on, often accompanied by hushed whispers and sideways glances in his direction. The welcoming smiles he received were now brittle, stretched thin over something hard and wary. He tried talking to Claire again, hoping against hope that his own sister might retain some shred of independent thought, some horror at the town's secret. He found her arranging pies on a trestle table, her movements precise, almost mechanical. "Clara," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to talk. About the festival. About what really happens here." She didn't look at him. "Ethan, I'm busy. We can talk later." "No, now," he insisted, lowering his voice. "Clara, I know. I know about the sacrifice. About the Harvest King." Her hand froze over a lattice-topped apple pie. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her expression wasn't shocked or horrified. It was cold, distant, and tinged with something that looked disturbingly like pity. "You spoke to Silas Blackwood, didn't you?" she said flatly. "That crazy old man. You shouldn't listen to his rambling." "It's not rambling, Clara. I've seen things, historical records, the missing backpacker." "The backpacker left," she interrupted sharply, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And Silas is lost in his grief. You're letting him upset you, Ethan. You were always too sensitive, too quick to imagine the worst." "Imagine? Clara, this is real. They kill someone every year." "Don't say that," she hissed, glancing around nervously. People nearby were subtly angling their bodies towards them, listening. "You don't understand our ways. You left. You abandoned us, abandoned Mom. You don't get to come back here and judge, stirring up trouble with crazy old hermits. So you know?" Ethan felt his blood run cold. "You know, and you accept it?" Clara looked away, her jaw tight. "We do what we have to do. For the Hollow. For survival. For the prosperity that feeds us, that keeps Mom comfortable in her old age. It's the way it's always been. The price we pay for this peace, this bounty." The casual acceptance, the justification delivered with such chilling pragmatism by his own sister, broke something inside Ethan. The hope that he might find an ally, Someone else, horrified by the truth, evaporated. He wasn't just an outsider anymore, he was actively perceived as a threat to their entire way of life, to the pact that guaranteed their unnatural abundance. The encounters grew colder. Mr. Carson, who had previously clapped him on the shoulder, now nodded curtly and turned away. Mrs. Gable avoided his eyes altogether, fumbling with her wares if he came near her stall. Even the children, who had initially regarded him with shy curiosity, now seemed to whisper and point before scurrying away. He felt the collective gaze of Havenwood Hollow settle upon him, heavy and unwavering. It was in the way Sheriff Brody seemed to coincidentally appear wherever Ethan went, his presence a constant, silent reminder of authority. It was in the way groups of men working on festival structures would pause and watch him pass, their tools held loosely in their hands. It was in the sudden stillness that fell over the communal dining area when he entered. He realized with dawning horror that the entire town was complicit. Whether through active participation, fearful silence, or willful ignorance, they were all bound together by the secret. They were a single organism, protecting itself from a perceived infection, him. His questions, his unease, his association with Silas, his very presence now that the intended king was gone, had marked him. The cheerful facade of the Harvest Festival now seemed utterly grotesque, a brightly painted death mask. The overflowing bounty felt obscene, fertilized by blood. And the united community, once merely stifling, now felt like a pack of predators, circling, waiting for the moment to close in. He was trapped among them, and the horrifying truth he had uncovered had just painted a target squarely on his back. With Ethan now clearly identified as a threat, the community's tactics shifted. Open hostility was too disruptive to the carefully maintained facade of festive harmony. Instead, they began a subtle, insidious campaign of psychological manipulation, designed to make him doubt his own sanity, isolate him further, and discredit him should he try to expose the truth. The gaslighting started subtly. He'd mentioned his conversation with Silas to Clara, only for her to look blankly at him. "Silas? Ethan, you haven't been near that creepy old cabin, have you? I told you he's not right in the head. You must have imagined talking to him." He'd find objects in his room slightly moved, a book placed on the wrong side of the nightstand, his jacket folded differently than he left it. Small things, easily dismissed, but designed to create a nagging sense of disorientation, to make him question his own memory and perception. Conversations he was sure he'd had were denied. He approached Mr. Henderson, the general store owner whom the missing backpacker had supposedly helped. "Mr. Henderson, about that fellow Reed, did he mention anything about feeling uncomfortable here before he left?" Henderson peered at him over his spectacles, looking genuinely bewildered. "Reed? Oh, the young man Sheriff Brody mentioned? Can't say I recall him helping me with anything, son. Must be mistaken. Memory plays tricks, doesn't it?" He chuckled, a dry, papery sound, but his eyes held no humor. Sheriff Brody became a master of calm dismissal. When Ethan tried to voice his concerns again, citing the historical patterns and Silas's confession, Brody adopted a paternal, concerned tone. "Ethan, listen to me. You've been through a lot, coming back here after so long, your mother being unwell. It's understandable you're feeling stressed, maybe a bit paranoid." He leaned in conspiratorially. "That Silas fellow. He's been spinning wild tales for years, ever since his wife passed. Tragic business. But you can't let his delusions get to you. You're seeing connections that aren't there." Brody's delivery was flawless. He radiated calm authority and reasonable concern, making Ethan's frantic certainty sound like the ravings of a troubled mind. The sheriff suggested he get some rest, maybe enjoy the cider competition, take his mind off things. Every attempt Ethan made to present his evidence was met with gentle deflection, feigned worry about his mental state, or outright denial packaged as helpful correction. Even his mother, in her moments of lucidity, seemed programmed. "Ethan, dear," she murmured one afternoon, clutching his hand. "Don't fret so. Havenwood takes care of its own. Just be grateful for the harvest. Accept the blessings." Her words, likely coached by Clara, felt like another turn of the psychological screw. Minor incidents escalated slightly. He'd arranged to meet someone, only for them to claim the meeting was never set. He'd leave his car keys on the kitchen counter, only to find them inexplicably back in his jacket pocket upstairs. Someone helpfully pointed out he'd left his car window down overnight, something he was certain he hadn't done, adding with a chuckle, "Getting forgetful in your old age, Ethan? He wasn't even 30. The constant, low-level manipulation began to take its toll. Sleep offered little respite, filled with fragmented nightmares of smiling faces and hidden knives. During the day, The relentless cheerfulness of the festival, juxtaposed with the cold watchfulness directed at him, created a jarring dissonance that frayed his nerves. Was he imagining the hostility? Was Silas really just a grieving, delusional old man? Had he misinterpreted the historical fragments? He knew, logically, that what Silas revealed felt terrifyingly real, fitting the unsettling atmosphere and the town's unnatural prosperity. But the community's unified front, their subtle chipping away at his confidence, was incredibly effective. They weren't just hiding a secret, they were actively trying to rewrite his reality, to make him the problem, the unstable element in their perfect picture. The gaslighting served a dual purpose, to break his resolve and make him doubt himself, and to paint him as unreliable to any potential outside observer, though the chances of one appearing felt increasingly slim. If he started shouting about sacrifices and conspiracies, who would believe him when the friendly sheriff, his own sister, and the entire town patiently explained that poor Ethan was just stressed and confused, perhaps influenced by the local eccentric? He felt increasingly isolated, adrift in a sea of smiling, complicit faces. The psychological pressure was immense, a constant thrum beneath the surface of the festival noise. They were trying to make him crack, to either silence him through self-doubt or push him into an outburst that would confirm their narrative of his instability. And as the final days of the festival drew closer, the pressure intensified, becoming almost unbearable. Ethan knew he couldn't rely solely on Silas's testimony or the fragmented historical clues, especially while the town actively worked to undermine his sanity. He needed tangible proof, something undeniable that would anchor him to the horrifying reality and perhaps, just perhaps, give him leverage or a direction for escape. Silas had mentioned the ritual site, an old stone circle, hidden deep in the woods. Finding it became Ethan's obsession. Silas had been vague about the location, gesturing only towards the dense woods bordering the eastern edge of the valley, far from his own cabin. Fearful of drawing attention, Ethan waited until the heart of the festival's penultimate day, when most of the townspeople were preoccupied with the grand parade and the judging of prize-winning livestock. The noise and distraction provided cover. He slipped away from the edge of the crowd, heart pounding, and skirted the main roads, heading towards the eastern woods using overgrown back paths he vaguely remembered from childhood explorations. The woods here were thicker, older, than those near Silas's cabin. Ancient oaks and maples formed a dense canopy, blocking out the cheerful afternoon sun and plunging the forest floor into premature twilight. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else. A faint, almost metallic tang, similar to what he'd noticed in town, but stronger here, more primal. He pushed through tangled underbrush, following faint animal trails, trying to recall Silas's haunted expression. Deep, Silas had said. Where the trees grow thickest and the ground feels old. Ethan scanned the forest floor, looking for any sign of a path, any indication that people regularly traversed this area. After nearly an hour of searching, pushing deeper into the silent woods, he found it. Not a clear path, but subtle signs, a broken branch here, a patch of slightly flattened ferns there, scuff marks on mossy rocks that suggested occasional passage. It wasn't a well-trodden route, but it hinted at deliberate, infrequent use. He followed these faint markers, his senses on high alert, the silence of the woods pressing in on him. The trail led him gradually uphill, towards a rocky outcrop shrouded in mist that clung stubbornly despite the clear day beyond the woods. As he drew closer, the faint metallic smell intensified, mingling with a cloying, sickly sweet odor he couldn't identify. He felt a prickling sensation on his skin, a primitive sense of dread emanating from the woods ahead. He crested a small rise and stopped dead, the breath catching in his throat. Below him, nestled in a natural clearing surrounded by towering, gnarled trees, was the stone circle. It wasn't large, perhaps 30 feet across, but it radiated an aura of immense age and dark purpose. Rough-hewn stones, dark and stained with lichen and something that looked disturbingly like old rust, stood sentinel in a rough circle. Some were still upright, others leaned precariously, and a few lay fallen, half swallowed by the earth. In the center stood a single, flat-topped stone, larger than the others, clearly serving as an altar. The ground within the circle was strangely barren, contrasting sharply with the lush undergrowth surrounding it. And the altar stone. It was stained. Dark patches, soaked deep into the porous rock, spoke of countless rituals, countless offerings. Ethan felt bile rise in his throat. Around the base of the altar, he saw them, small, desiccated remnants of past offerings. Dried flowers, strands of faded ribbon, small, carved wooden effigies, and disturbingly, what looked like clumps of hair and small, brittle bone fragments, possibly animal. Possibly not. The sickly sweet smell was stronger here, emanating from a recent-looking dark patch on the altar's surface, still slightly sticky to the touch. Had there been some preparatory ritual already? Or was this left over from last year? Strange symbols were carved into the standing stones, symbols he didn't recognize, spirals, jagged lines, eye-like motifs, weathered by time but still discernible. They felt ancient, alien, radiating a quiet malevolence. The air within the circle was heavy, oppressive, carrying a palpable weight of fear, violence, and desperate supplication. This was not a place of peaceful worship, it was a place of slaughter, steeped in generations of terror and blood. He stepped cautiously into the circle, feeling an irrational urge to turn and flee. The silence here was different, not peaceful, but watchful, charged. He ran his fingers over the cold, rough surface of a standing stone, tracing one of the disturbing symbols. This was it. Undeniable proof. Silas wasn't delusional. The history wasn't fragmented coincidence. The town's prosperity was bought and paid for, right here, on this blood-soaked stone. Suddenly, he heard a twig snap nearby. He froze, every muscle tensing. He scanned the surrounding trees, his heart hammering against his ribs. Was someone watching him? Had he been followed? He ducked behind one of the larger standing stones, peering out into the dense woods. Nothing moved. Only the wind rustling the leaves, sounding like whispers. But the feeling of being observed lingered. He knew he couldn't stay long. He had found the confirmation he needed, but discovering the site also meant he possessed dangerous knowledge. He took one last look at the grim altar, the silent stones, the barren ground, searing the image into his mind. This horrific place was the dark heart of Havenwood Hollow. He backed away slowly, retreating from the circle, then turned and scrambled back the way he came, pushing through the undergrowth with frantic urgency, the oppressive atmosphere of the stone circle clinging to him like grave dirt. He had the proof, but the discovery also solidified his own peril. He hadn't just stumbled upon a location, he had trespassed on sacred, secret ground. And in Havenwood Hollow, such transgressions surely carried a heavy price. The discovery of the ritual site solidified the horror but offered no immediate escape. Ethan returned from the woods shaken, dirty, and acutely aware of his precarious position. The final day of the harvest festival dawned bright and clear, the picture of autumnal perfection, but for Ethan, it felt like a countdown to doom. The air buzzed with heightened excitement, a fever pitch of forced merriment that now seemed utterly macabre. Today, the harvest king or queen would be chosen. He tried to blend in, moving through the crowded town square, observing the final preparations, the games, the music. But the knowledge he carried made him hyper-aware of everything. He saw the way Mayor Abernathy, presiding over events with benevolent smiles and booming pronouncements, occasionally cast sharp, assessing glances towards him. Abernathy, the respected community leader, the high priest of this bloody tradition. His jovial facade now seemed monstrous. Sheriff Brody was everywhere, his presence a constant, calming influence on the surface, but Ethan saw the watchfulness in his eyes, the way he subtly steered people, managed the flow of the crowd, ensuring everything proceeded according to plan. He seemed to always be positioned somewhere Ethan could see him, a silent reminder of inescapable authority. The interactions with the townsfolk became even more pointed. People went out of their way to engage him in conversation, but the topics felt loaded. "Enjoying the festivities, Ethan?" Mrs. Gable asked, offering him a candied apple with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So good to have you fully embracing the spirit this year." Fully embracing the spirit. Was that code? "You know, Ethan," Mr. Carson remarked, sidling up to him near the cider press. "This town. It has a way of holding on to its own. Once Havenwood's in your blood, it never truly leaves you." His tone was conversational, but the underlying message felt like a tightening noose. He noticed people pointing him out to others he didn't recognize, perhaps residents from outlying farms, drawn in for the final rituals. He heard snippets of conversation. "Martha Miller's boy, the one who left, asking questions. Abernathy seems to think he's suitable." Suitable. The word chilled him to the bone. With the backpacker gone, the community needed a replacement. Silas had warned him. His investigation, his connection to Silas, his outsider-insider status, it all converged. He was the logical, perhaps the only, candidate left who fit their twisted criteria. Someone connected enough to the Hollow for the sacrifice to have meaning, yet disconnected enough for his permanent absence to be manageable, explainable. The honors began subtly. During the pie-eating contest, Mayor Abernathy made a point of singling Ethan out, inviting him onto the stage with exaggerated warmth. "Let's give a big Havenwood welcome home to Ethan Miller. Good to have you back celebrating with us, son." The crowd applauded, their faces beaming, but their eyes felt like weights, pitting him in the spotlight. He mumbled an excuse and quickly retreated, feeling his cheeks burn. Later, during a ceremonial toast to the harvest, Sheriff Brody raised his mug. To the bounty the Hollow provides. And to those who return to appreciate it. He made direct eye contact with Ethan, a barely perceptible nod accompanying the words. It wasn't a welcome, it was a designation. Panic began to claw at Ethan's throat. He had to get out. Now. He casually started walking towards the edge of town, where he'd parked his car near his mother's house, trying to appear aimless, just stretching his legs. But as he neared the main road leading out of the valley, he saw a makeshift barricade, hay bales and festive garlands blocking the way. Two burly farmers stood nearby, ostensibly directing traffic for a later procession, but their stances were rigid, watchful. Roads closed for the grand procession, folks. One of them called out cheerfully to anyone approaching. Won't be open again till morning. Ethan's blood ran cold. He tried another route, a smaller farm track leading over the western hills. It too was blocked, this time by a parked tractor, engine off, with Sheriff Brody leaning against it, calmly observing the festival grounds. Brody tipped his hat as Ethan approached, his smile unwavering. Trapped. He pulled out his phone. No signal. He vaguely remembered the reception always being spotty in the valley, but this felt deliberate. Complete isolation. He realized with dawning, sickening horror that the selection wasn't a future event, it had already happened. The subtle honors, the pointed comments, the blocked roads, they weren't deciding, they were confirming. They were preparing him. The community's gaze, which had turned cold and suspicious, now felt distinctly predatory. They weren't just watching him, they were guarding him. He thought of Silas, hidden away in his cabin. Was the old man safe? Or had his confession sealed his fate as well? Ethan felt a surge of guilt for potentially endangering him further. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. The festive lights strung across the square flickered on, casting an artificial glow. The final night of the Harvest Festival was approaching, and Ethan Miller, the reluctant son returned home, was the guest of honor, the chosen king, marked for sacrifice. The cheerful noise of the celebration transformed into a terrifying roar, the prelude to his own demise. As twilight deepened into night, the Havenwood Hollow Harvest Festival reached its fever pitch. Torches were lit, casting flickering, dancing shadows that distorted the familiar shapes of the town square into something primal and unsettling. The air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke from the enormous bonfire being built in the center, mingled with roasting meat, spilled ale, and the underlying metallic tang that now seemed to stick in Ethan's throat. Music played, fiddles sawing frantically, drums beating a relentless, driving rhythm that vibrated through the soles of Ethan's shoes. People danced with wild abandon, their faces flushed, eyes overly bright. It was a caricature of celebration, a frenzied, almost desperate gaiety designed, Ethan now knew, to mask the terrible purpose of the night. He was trapped. Every path out of the valley remained blocked, guarded by smiling, watchful townsfolk. His phone remained useless, a dead weight in his pocket. He had briefly considered trying to reach Silas again, but the risk of being intercepted, or worse, leading the community directly to the old man, was too great. He was utterly alone, surrounded by 100 smiling executioners. He tried to lose himself in the crowd, to become invisible, but it was impossible. People seemed to subtly steer him, guide him. A hand would clap his shoulder, gently turning him back towards the center of the square if he strayed too near the edges. Someone would offer him a drink, their eyes lingering on his face, assessing his state. Clara found him near the refreshment table, her face strained beneath a forced smile. "Ethan, there you are. Mayor Abernathy wants you to join the honored guests near the stage soon. For the final ceremony." Her voice was tight, avoiding his gaze. "Clara, you can't let this happen," he pleaded, keeping his voice low, trying one last time to appeal to the sister he remembered. "There's nothing to let happen, Ethan," she said, her eyes finally meeting his, cold and resolute. "It's tradition. It's necessary. Try to understand. It's an honor." The word honor felt like a physical blow. He pulled away from her, stumbling back into the throng. The music seemed louder, the dancing more frenetic, the firelight casting demonic shadows on the laughing faces. The festive atmosphere, which had seemed merely forced before, now felt utterly nightmarish, a terrifying vortex pulling him towards its center. He saw Sheriff Brody standing near the bonfire, conferring quietly with Mayor Abernathy. Abernathy nodded, then clapped Brody on the back, his expression one of grim satisfaction. They both looked towards Ethan, their faces momentarily illuminated by a burst of flame from the pyre. There was no benevolence left, only cold, hard purpose. Panic surged, sharp and acidic. He had to do something. Running was impossible. Fighting seemed futile against the unified force of the entire community. Could he expose them? Shout the truth? He climbed onto a nearby crate, drawing himself up. "Listen," he yelled, his voice cracking, struggling to be heard over the din. "Listen to me. This festival. It's a lie." The music faltered for a beat. A few heads turned, curious or annoyed. "It's not a celebration," Ethan shouted desperately. "It's a sacrifice. They kill someone every year. The Harvest King. It's a human sacrifice." A wave of silence rippled outwards from him, but it wasn't shocked silence. It was cold, heavy, disapproving. The smiles vanished from the faces nearest him, replaced by stony expressions. The music stuttered back to life, slightly louder this time, as if to drown him out. Sheriff Brody started walking towards him, his face calm, but his eyes hard. "Now, Ethan," Brody said, his voice carrying easily over the music. "Sounds like you've had a bit too much cider. Why don't you come down from there before you hurt yourself?" "He's lying," Ethan yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Brody, then Abernathy. "They know. They all know. They killed the backpacker, Reed. Or maybe he escaped. Now they want me." Mayor Abernathy stepped forward, his expression one of deep sorrow and concern. My boy," he said, his voice filled with false pity. "The grief for your mother, the stress of returning. It's clearly taken its toll. Friends," he addressed the crowd, his voice resonating with authority, "our Ethan is unwell. He needs rest. Let's help him." Two large men, farmers Ethan recognized, moved towards the crate, their expressions blank. The crowd murmured, not with alarm, but with agreement. "Poor Ethan. Not himself. Needs to rest." They were closing ranks, reinforcing the gaslighting narrative, dismissing his desperate warning as delirium. He jumped down from the crate before the men could reach him, pushing past startled onlookers, trying to weave through the dense crowd. But hands reached out, not violently, but firmly, guiding him, blocking his path, turning him inexorably back towards the stage, towards the waiting bonfire. The entire community moved as one, a silent, suffocating tide. He was herded, gently but relentlessly, towards the front, near the crackling pyre. The heat washed over his face. Mayor Abernathy stood on the stage now, holding a ceremonial wreath woven from golden wheat and dark red poppies. The final ceremony was about to begin. The ritual was imminent. He was trapped in the heart of the nightmare, the honored guest at his own sacrificial feast. "Friends. Neighbors. People of Havenwood Hollow." Mayor Abernathy's voice boomed, silencing the music and the chatter. The firelight flickered across his face, emphasizing the lines of feigned benevolence and underlying fanaticism. "The time has come. The culmination of our joyous harvest festival. A time to give thanks for the bounty that sustains us, and to honor the spirit of the Hollow." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd, not murmurs of fear, but of anticipation, of solemn importance. Ethan stood frozen near the front, hemmed in by the unyielding bodies of the townsfolk. He scanned the faces, Clara, stony-faced near the back, Sheriff Brody, standing impassively beside the stage, the farmers, the shopkeepers, the families, all watching Abernathy, their expressions rapt, united in their dark purpose. "Tradition dictates," Abernathy continued, holding up the wreath, "that we select one among us to embody the spirit of the harvest, to receive our collective gratitude, and to be honored as our Harvest King." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. His eyes swept the crowd, lingering for a calculated moment on Ethan. "This year," Abernathy declared, his voice ringing with false reverence, "after much consideration by the council, reflecting on who truly embodies the return to our values, the appreciation of our bounty, the very spirit of homecoming. The honor falls upon Ethan Miller." A collective gasp went through the crowd, quickly followed by applause, polite, measured, chillingly devoid of genuine surprise. It was exactly as Ethan had feared. The trap had been sprung. He was publicly named, locked into the role by the weight of tradition and the unanimous gaze of the community. "Come forward, Ethan." Abernathy beckoned, smiling broadly. "Come receive your honor." Ethan stood rooted to the spot, shaking his head, his mouth dry. "No," he whispered, then louder, "no. I won't do it. You know what this means. You're murderers." The crowd shifted uneasily, but no one spoke out. Brody took a step forward, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his holstered service weapon, a subtle but clear threat. The two large farmers who had approached him earlier moved closer, flanking him. "Don't be difficult, Ethan," one of them muttered, his voice low and rough. "It's an honor. Accept it." Desperation fueled a surge of adrenaline. Ethan shoved the farmer beside him, hard, knocking him off balance, and made a break for it. He plunged into the dense crowd, pushing, scrambling, trying to get away from the stage, the bonfire, the horrifying ritual. For a moment, chaos erupted. People stumbled, shouted in surprise. But the community reacted with chilling efficiency. They didn't panic or give chase wildly. Instead, they moved, almost instinctively, to block his path, forming shifting walls of bodies, guiding him, funneling him. Hands reached out, grabbing at his clothes, his arms. He twisted away, ducking under grasping fingers, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He broke free momentarily, finding himself near the edge of the square, the dark fields beckoning just beyond the last row of houses. Freedom seemed tantalizingly close. He sprinted across the trampled grass, towards the shadows. But figures emerged from the darkness, more townsfolk, strategically positioned. They formed a silent cordon, blocking his escape route. He skidded to a halt, panting, trapped between the cordon and the main body of the festival crowd, which was now advancing slowly, methodically, towards him. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering torchlight and the bonfire's glow, were grim, determined masks. There was no anger, no malice, just the quiet, unwavering certainty of purpose. They were a single entity, ensuring the ritual proceeded. He saw Sheriff Brody calmly directing the human net closing around him. There was nowhere left to run. He lashed out, swinging wildly at the nearest figures, but they easily subdued him, strong hands gripping his arms, pinning him. He struggled, kicking, shouting curses and pleas, but it was useless against their combined strength and silent resolve. He was dragged, struggling but overpowered, back towards the center of the square, back towards the heat of the bonfire, back towards the stage where Mayor Abernathy waited, the Harvest King wreath held ready. The crowd parted silently to let them through, their eyes following his desperate struggle with cold, dispassionate acceptance. "It is time," Abernathy declared, his voice cutting through Ethan's frantic shouts. "Bring forth the Harvest King." Ethan was forced onto the low stage, his arms pinned behind him. He stood there, panting, disheveled, glaring defiance at Abernathy, at Brody, at the sea of watching faces. The festive music had stopped completely now. The only sounds were the crackling of the bonfire and Ethan's ragged breathing. The ritual, hidden for so long beneath layers of celebration, was now stripped bare, its horrifying purpose laid out under the night sky. The procession began. Flanked by the grim-faced farmers, urged forward by Sheriff Brody's implacable presence, Ethan was led away from the dying bonfire in the silent town square, towards the dark woods. A select group of townsfolk followed, led by Mayor Abernathy, torches held high, their faces illuminated in the flickering light, set in expressions of solemn duty. The festive facade had completely dissolved, replaced by the grim reality of the ancient rite. They moved along the barely discernible path Ethan had discovered earlier, the journey to the stone circle feeling like a condemned man's final walk. Ethan stumbled, resisting weakly, but the hands holding him were firm, unyielding. He searched the faces in the procession. His sister Clara was not among them, nor were most of the younger generation. It seemed the final act was reserved for the core believers, the elders, the enforcers. He saw old man Silas standing at the edge of the trees as they left the square, a lone, frail figure watching them go, his face etched with impotent anguish. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, a silent exchange of terror and despair. Silas made no move to intervene, he knew it was futile. The oppressive atmosphere of the woods intensified as they neared the clearing. The metallic dang was sharp in the air. When they reached the stone circle, the torchlight cast eerie, dancing shadows on the ancient, weathered stones. The central altar stone seemed to gleam darkly, waiting. Ethan was pushed forward, forced to his knees before the altar. He looked up at Mayor Abernathy, who stood opposite him, his eyes gleaming with fervent belief. Sheriff Brody stood to one side, his hand never far from his weapon, ensuring there would be no escape. "Why?" Ethan choked out, his voice raw. "Why continue this? This barbarity?" "It is not barbarity, Ethan," Abernathy said, his voice calm, almost gentle, which made it even more horrifying. "It is balance. It is reciprocity. The land gives to us, ensures our prosperity, protects us from the blights and hardships that plague the outside world. In return, it requires a gift. A life, freely given or taken, to replenish the soil, To appease the ancient spirit that dwells here. Appease? Ethan spat. You murder people for good crops. You hide behind tradition to justify killing. Tradition is the bedrock of community, Ethan, Abernathy countered smoothly. It connects us to our ancestors, to the pact they made for survival. We honor that pact. We ensure the survival and prosperity of Havenwood Hollow for generations to come. Is one life, weighed against the well-being of the entire community, truly too high a price? Ethan scanned the faces of the assembled townsfolk, the Carsons, the Brewsters, faces he'd known since childhood. Their expressions were closed, resolute. They believed this. Or they had convinced themselves they believed it, bound by fear of what might happen if the sacrifices stopped. There has to be another way. Ethan pleaded, desperation clawing at him. You can't just keep doing this. There is no other way for Havenwood Hollow, Abernathy stated flatly. This is our path. Our burden. Our blessing. He picked up a ceremonial knife from the altar, its obsidian blade gleaming wickedly in the torchlight. It looked ancient, terrifyingly sharp. You should feel honored, Ethan. Your life will nourish the roots of this community, ensure its continued flourishing. You return to the soil that birthed you. Ethan's eyes darted around, searching for any weakness, any hesitation, any chance. He looked at the knife, then at the symbols carved into the standing stones. He remembered Silas's fragmented stories, the historical notes. A desperate gamble formed in his mind. You think this appeases the land? Ethan cried out, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. You think this guarantees prosperity? What happens when the offering isn't enough? Or when it's unwilling? Silas said his wife. She questioned things. Was the harvest good that year? Was it? A flicker of doubt crossed a few faces. Abernathy's expression tightened. Do not listen to the ramblings of a broken man or twist our sacred rites. And what about the blight in the 30s? Ethan pushed, remembering the ledger. My great-grandfather wrote the tithe was paid, but Silas's father questioned it. Was the harvest truly blessed then, or did the questions themselves taint the offering? He was grasping at straws, trying to sow discord, to play on their deepest fears, not just the fear of the entity, but the fear of the ritual failing. Silence him, Abernathy commanded, raising the knife. But Ethan surged upwards, fueled by sheer terror, driving his shoulder into the farmer holding his left arm. He scrambled backwards, putting the altar between himself and Abernathy. You're afraid, he shouted. Afraid it won't work. Afraid that killing me, someone who knows, someone who rejects this, will break the pact, not fulfill it. What happens then, Mayor? What happens when the crops fail because of what you do tonight? For a heart-stopping moment, hesitation rippled through the group. The absolute certainty faltered. Sheriff Brody took a step forward, drawing his weapon partially. Mayor? Abernathy's face contorted with fury and, perhaps, a sliver of fear. The ritual depended on belief, on unwavering execution. Ethan's defiance, his knowledge, his final desperate attempt to undermine their faith, was a dangerous contamination. The offering will be made, Abernathy roared, lunging around the altar, the obsidian knife raised high. Ethan scrambled away, dodging behind one of the large standing stones as the final, desperate confrontation began amidst the ancient, blood-soaked circle. The moment hung suspended, Abernathy lunging, the knife descending, the townsfolk frozen between ingrained belief and the seed of doubt Ethan had desperately planted. In that instant of hesitation, salvation came from the most unexpected quarter. A figure erupted from the trees at the edge of the clearing, Old Man Silas, his face a mask of desperate resolve, wielding a heavy, gnarled walking stick like a weapon. He let out a guttural yell, more fury than fear, and charged not at Abernathy, but at the base of the largest, most precariously leaning standing stone near the altar. No more, Silas roared, striking the base of the stone with all his frail might. The debt is paid in sorrow, not blood. The impact, combined with the stone's age and instability, was just enough. With a groan of ancient rock, the massive monolith tilted further, then crashed downwards with terrifying speed, narrowly missing Abernathy but striking the altar stone with incredible force. The ceremonial knife flew from Abernathy's hand. The altar stone cracked, a spider web of fractures spreading across its stained surface. Chaos erupted. The townsfolk cried out in shock and horror, momentarily distracted by the desecration of their sacred site and Silas's sudden, suicidal intervention. Sheriff Brody instinctively turned towards Silas, raising his weapon. Ethan didn't wait. This was his only chance. He scrambled away from the confusion around the fallen stone, using the ensuing panic as cover. He plunged into the dark woods opposite where Silas had emerged, ignoring the branches that tore at his clothes and skin. Behind him, he heard shouting, Brody's enraged commands, and then, chillingly, a single, sharp crack, a gunshot echoing through the trees. He didn't know if it was aimed at Silas or fired in warning, and he couldn't afford to look back. He ran blindly, fueled by adrenaline and terror, pushing deeper into the unfamiliar woods, away from the desecrated circle, away from the sounds of the disrupted ritual. He stumbled, fell, picked himself up, his lungs burning, his only thought to put as much distance as possible between himself and Havenwood Hollow. He navigated by instinct, by the faint pre-dawn light beginning to filter through the canopy, heading steadily uphill, away from the valley floor. Hours seemed to pass. The sounds of pursuit, if there ever were any, faded behind him. Finally, bruised, bleeding, and utterly exhausted, he broke through the tree line onto a ridge overlooking the valley from the far side. Below him, Havenwood Hollow lay bathed in the soft light of dawn. From this distance, it looked peaceful, idyllic, the fields shimmering with dew, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. The perfect picture was restored. But Ethan knew the truth. He knew about the cracked altar, the disrupted ritual, the potential sacrifice of Silas, who had bought Ethan his freedom at an unknown, likely ultimate, cost. He looked down at the town, a place of poisoned prosperity and chilling secrets, and felt a profound wave of revulsion and grief. He didn't know what would happen now. Would the harvest fail? Would the community descend into panic or find another victim? Would they hunt for him? He couldn't know. He only knew he had escaped. He turned his back on Havenwood Hollow, the place of his birth and almost death, and started walking west, towards the rising sun, towards an unknown future. He was free, but the unnatural beauty of the hollow, the weight of its secret, and the ghost of Silas's sacrifice would haunt him forever. He carried the scars, visible and invisible, of the harvest festival, a permanent reminder of the terrible price some communities pay for perfection, and the darkness that can lurk beneath the most bountiful harvest. The dawn felt less like a new beginning and more like the first day of a very long haunting. Enjoyed this story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.